Welcome to Infinite Bandwidth, Zero Latency. My name's Sean Fensom. I'm the chair of an organisation called Manchester Digital, which is, together with the Open University, has sponsored, as it were, this strand in Future Everything. What we have this morning is a panel discussion where we're going to be looking at the question of infinite bandwidth and zero latency, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a moment. After I've done that explanation, Ken Eason here, who was present at a seminar we held yesterday, will be introducing us to some of the concepts which were discussed and raised at that seminar. And then our invited panel, all of whom were at the same seminar, will be discussing together with you some of the issues which come out of that. So the seminar yesterday was a day-long event. There were some 20 people present. As I say, this is a selection of the people from that. Brian Condon, Trevor Wood-Harper, Tony Hurst, Mike Ryan, and Clem Herman will be introducing themselves properly in a moment. But first of all, I will do the what I said earlier, just to introduce the topic. If you look back to the period before the advent of first-generation broadband, that's the kind of broadband you get down the telephone line or on your cable TV connection, then it was fairly easy to see that the advent of broadband, which had been long anticipated during the 1990s, would have an effect on the kinds of applications and services that people would use when connected to the internet. I think there was a general anticipation that things like video, which require a lot more bandwidth, and indeed sound, what was in those days very often referred to as multimedia, in fact, would become a more important part of what you do when you connect your computer effectively to other computers across the net. But when that first generation broadband actually came about, there were a number of things that happened which people arguably didn't really anticipate at all. As I say, people were anticipating that there would be a move to more multimedia-rich applications and services, but no one anticipated YouTube. No one anticipated that particular model whereby that content, the multimedia, the video, would be contributed by users across the planet. Equally, during the 1990s, with the growth of dial-up internet, people were exchanging information, were discussing things in forums and in other ways through email. And it was easy to see that there would be access to a much wider amount of information. But no one had anticipated Wikipedia and the notion that there would be a massive repository of textual information that would be created, again, by people contributing from all over the planet, and indeed that would be a free resource. That was also something of a surprise. And similarly, the notion of chat rooms were already established. They were actually a very lively chat room culture in France in the 1980s. And yet, no one anticipated social networking like Facebook or indeed Twitter. So while it was possible to see some of the changes that the advent of broadband would bring about, most of the really big disruptive changes weren't anticipated at all. And one of the reasons you could say that they weren't anticipated was because there was too much focus on speed. Broadband was seen as being a big leap in speed, and the arguably an even more important change was the fact that a broadband internet connection is always on. You switch on your computer, you're connected to the net, and therefore using the net as a reference source becomes that much more easy. We're about to go through another fundamental change in the technology of connecting computers to each other and to the net through what is usually called next generation access, which means very, very high-speed wireless, but more importantly, perhaps, well, that's an interesting argument which we might debate, the use of fibre connections that go all the way to the business or the home. And the scope for increasing the amount of bandwidth with those technologies, particularly with fibre, is almost limitless. People talk about 100 megabits per second fibre connections now, but that's almost an artificial limit. And fibre can deliver a great deal more than that. So the theme of infinite bandwidth, zero latency, is to try and think ahead as to what the kind of disruptive changes and new applications and services that might come about as a result of a very dramatic increase in the amount of bandwidth. What you might call the, if you'll forgive the allusion to Rumsfeld, the unknown unknowns. Just the same as the first generation broadband wasn't just about speed, it was about being always on. There are characteristics with these new networks which are not just about speed, and one of those is latency. The delay time between a piece of information leaving a server somewhere on the planet and arriving at the client computer. And that, as that shrinks, that arguably has a very great difference as well. So the intellectual exercise, if you like, is to say, what if these things didn't matter anymore? What if bandwidth was effectively unlimited, infinite bandwidth? And what if latency was effectively not an issue anymore, or for most applications, zero latency? And so that's what we're discussing today. And that's what we spent a whole day talking about yesterday. So I'm going to hand over to Ken now, who's going to briefly describe some of the things that he picked up from the session yesterday.
We just wait and see whether I can communicate by old-fashioned means to get the PowerPoint switched on. I'm a professor of cognitive psychology from Loughborough University, and I spent the best part of 40 years trying to track user behaviour in the use of all the many forms of computing and web-based things that we've presented to them over the years, and it remains pretty much a mystery to me. And I think what we're going to do is give them more things to play with. So what are they going to do with them next, I think is the way I would approach this kind of question. We christened this iBeazle as the new possibilities that we're going to have in the future. One of the reasons why I think it's quite difficult to predict what happens when you get a shift in capability like this is that we've got a rather complex world that we're working in. We've got a new kind of technology here, one of enormous power and potential, which we're going to put all sorts of applications into, and we've got a user community that's going to pull on that and shape it in all sorts of strange ways. And the whole thing is going on within a socio-political and economic environment which hopefully will promote what we're up to, will almost certainly shape it in various ways and might possibly constrain it in a number of ways as well. So with this great mix, what we're trying to do right now is dream about what the emergent, significant, disruptive applications are going to be that are going to come out of that. That's our challenge, I think. And that was the challenge of the workshop yesterday. We met with a number of other colleagues. We've got a wide range of backgrounds between us to try and imagine what will happen if we get infinite bandwidth and virtually zero latency. What applications will emerge and what kind of things will excite the user community and what will take off? As Sean says, we haven't been terribly good at identifying those kinds of disruptive applications in the past. Can we be better this time? And we're kind of collectively trying to get our thinking caps on that, and we're kind of inviting you to join in this examination as well. And what we're trying to do is, we can see some of the continuing trends, but where are the breakpoints? Where are the exciting new directions that come out of that? Can we be any better at working that out in the future? Now, what came out of yesterday? Well, all kinds of things. Now, I put this up. My colleagues haven't seen this either, so it'll probably be pretty much a mystery to them as well. I put this up to illustrate the range of things we debated yesterday. I can't hope to do justice to this, but in the panel discussion, we'll explore some of these, and no doubt some other things will occur as well. I spent some of last night contemplating this and trying to make sense of it. I'm sorry it's not a multimedia presentation. That was quite beyond me. Just getting the list up and worrying about it was all I could manage. But what I've done is I think there's a theme here, putting in the hands of our user community much more powerful, much faster capability so that they can explore and use vastly greater volumes of all sorts of content. They can also generate more content. And one of the things that strikes me about the user community at the moment is I hadn't appreciated the degree to which people would generate content themselves and put it into the web, and in particular to share and collaborate in that kind of process. So they were the kind of dominant themes. At the top here we've got some of the specific ideas about what people might do. Best before is, the metaphor here is what's in the fridge and how can you tell what is going off, and how can the systems help us track all that and how can we get more broadly into all the personal data that we all need to manage, wherever it is and wherever we are. How can we help in that kind of way? Intelligent matchmaking. There's a lot of matchmaking going on at the moment. What will happen to that in the future? And if it's a much richer world with a lot more potential matches, both social and business and global, it's going to be a pretty difficult job to make those matches. So what about digital butlers to help us with that kind of process? Now, I'm not going to go through all these like that, but we started out asking what we can do in that kind of way. One I really was interested in yesterday was the concept of artisans and craftsmen getting together on the web with a much more powerful ability to frame and fabricate the objects that they're designing together and then to turn them into real objects. How can we really make that a collaborative, real-time process? There's quite a number of things about the social space we all exist in and the way in which people are very keen to be in touch with others, and how can we move beyond Skyping? How can we really get in touch with one another maybe in a continuous social space, so that our metaphor was really, so we're not just getting to be in touch with them, but we're almost sharing meals with them in some way, and really engaging in a much more social way with other people. We went in a bit further down that road with perpetual holodecks, with the notion of holograms, and particularly in a future more aging society, particularly thinking of isolated people, the aged, people who can't be in touch with their families and friends a great deal. Can we create a world in which they're almost with their families in a holographic kind of world? Would they want that? That's another question, but what can we work on in that kind of area? I think as we come down this scale, we're moving into rather less specific things and into areas where we're saying, if we're going to give people access to this world in a useful way, there's a number of applications we need in order to crack this. How can we, if you've got an infinite data, how do you transform access to that? How do you search it? We're used to searching and browsing strategies. What more can we do to help people find their way around in this kind of process? We had a particularly interesting debate about latency maps. One of the things I know as a psychologist is that the latency in human relationships is absolutely critical. If you're in a website environment, you're often trying to establish trust. You're trying to understand the other person, empathize with them, put minor discrepancies into the timing of that, and it really throws it. So if we get latency down to zero, we might feel as though we're in a contemporary, I can't even say it, in a spontaneous process, which is natural to us, and where we can see and collect up those non-verbal cues that help us to judge the other people. Very fine adjustments we need in that kind of world. At the moment, we're talking about latency maps to try and understand where the delays are and what the experiences people have, and moving on to getting rid of them in where they're really critical. Some of the more business issues we talked about yesterday, if we've got this enormous resource, what will that do in terms of cutting the costs of innovation? Will it let 1,000 applications flower? Will it be fairly easy to enter this world and put something out there and see how it catches on? One of the things we talked about yesterday was dreams and nightmares. Every dream has its downsides and its problem area. We didn't dwell on that too much. We were being positive and constructive and trying to see the way forward. But we recognise that as you move into this kind of world, there are some issues that will be raised. And one of the things we put in here was a content control crisis. If we've got more traffic, more content, if it's faster, are we moving beyond the ability to control that? Are we heading for some sort of digital 9/11? Will the powers that be struggle to sustain any kind of control? Are we letting the bad boys loose in this world? Now, I would think we want to concentrate on the positive, but I think we must always be aware of the issues that it raises. Just finally, we talked also about all this power we have around every one of us as peers, and whether we can do more to share that power in a peer-to-peer way. We talked about broad neural networks. We didn't get as far as describing what people might do with that, but we're creating more potential for them to do things. I have a strong sense that we'll all be working to try and put power into people's hands. I hope I live long enough to see what people actually do with it. It could be very exciting. Well, I hope that gives you a flavour. My colleagues, I know, will probably say I got it all wrong, but also amplify and develop some of those themes. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Ken. I'm going to ask the panel to just introduce themselves and say a couple of words in a moment, and then we'll get into the discussion as soon as we can. But just a quick note to say, first of all, something I forgot to say, be good if you turned your mobiles to silent. And the other thing is, let's go with the hashtag #IBZL. I've already tweeted on that. And don't forget I think it's #FeatureEverything is the Future Everything tag as well. So who you are, a sentence or two on what really struck you from yesterday. I'm going to go for you first. Brian.
Hi. I'm going to use these things. Hi, I'm Brian Condon. What do I do? I'm working in a team of people on a collaborative project called the Centre for Creative Collaboration, which is near King's Cross in London, 4,000 square feet. We started in February, but we're not officially launched until June. We're running collaborative projects in that space, and it's great fun. And our projects are a mixture of artists, creatives, software coders, software engineers, electronics engineers. We're trying to kind of mix all that together, and it's kind of a mash-up style of working, which is one of the things we talked a lot about yesterday. The one that really, the one that I feel is my one up there, and we were working in teams, but my one is the real artisans. Because we were talking about the printing of everything. If you can digitally print in 3D objects, what does that do to the way in which craftspeople and artisans work, where the cost of distribution of products tends towards zero? So you design something in Lagos, for example, and print it in Manchester. And this idea of very low latency, so you can work in real time, collaboratively. What does that do to the making of things? And it's the making of things that really struck me about. About that idea. We had a fantastic discussion of it. It was extraordinary, and we want to jump beyond the idea that Virgin is going to squirt channels and channels of HD content into people's houses. I'm more interested in what comes out up to the network from what people do, and I think it's a very exciting thing to think about.
Thank you very much, Brian. Peter Kowalek from Manchester Business School, who was advertised as being on the panel, unfortunately is ill. And Trevor Woodharper, also from Manchester Business School, has very kindly agreed to take his place. Trevor.
Okay, thanks very much. My position at MBS is that I'm Professor of Information Systems and Organisational Change, supposed to be. But I suppose the thing is I have a very funny background, because my first degree was computer science. I then did a master's degree with a guy you probably don't know, but called Peter Checkland, ideas, and then started by doing a systems development method, and then used undergraduate students, and in such a way we actually started as a spin-off company at the University of Stagner. But to me, I suppose, thinking about what I learned from yesterday, is that perhaps MBS has a motto, and that motto is original thinking applied. And to me, I just think is that they're not really spending much time how is actually this rapid change what we're tending to do. So if you think about original thinking applied, for me, originally applied to practice, use, learn, and come back. And I think the question that we're now coming back is that this is changing so fast that we're not really trying to understand it. And this is perhaps more recognized of this change is not necessarily in business schools, but in sociology departments. And sociology departments now call a new school of thought, God knows how many they have already, but called socio-materiality. And that means that now that our lives have gone in such a way that we cannot really separate between socio and technical. So we're so intertwined together, it's part of our stuff. And I think one of my colleagues, she will talk a little bit later about some of the metaphor that we use in terms of cyborg and Windows. But I think the question is that for me, for universities, is that if we do not really understand this by linking theory and practice and that research and the rapid changes in businesses with technology, I think we have problems.
Thank you. Tony.
Okay, I'm Tony Hurst from the Department of Communication and Systems at the Open University, and I also spend a lot of time writing a blog at Useful Info, which is ouscful.info, spending a lot of time there looking about how to use the technology that's already around us in new ways, combining it typically, building mashups, very, very simple mashups that can afford quite powerful consequences. The group I was in yesterday, we quite quickly got into thinking around two applications, one of which was the latency map, which was an idea for a map just looking at the delays that are in a system, in the network at the moment, partly so that we could track it over time to see if the latency is coming down. And the second one, the idea we were looking around was the idea of vendor relationship management, so citizens having control of their own data and then releasing it to companies. And thinking about both of those as I was walking in here today, it struck me that what we were doing was we were assuming infinite bandwidth, zero latency. From that, we took the idea that this would mean ubiquitous access, so the network access would always be available and always taken for granted. But the tools we came up with actually are ways of getting around friction that might then be introduced to the system. So if we've got rid of the latency, what friction might then be introduced? So with the vendor relation management stuff, that's to do with individuals being able to, at the moment, we're prevented on accessing our own data. Companies hold data about us, Tesco holds data about us, Amazon holds data about us, Google holds data about us, but it's difficult for us to get hold of that information, so that's friction in the system. If we've got infinite connectivity, infinite bandwidth, then what are the things that are stopping us getting the things that we want to do? And this is control over the data we own. So it was the idea of one possible place for looking for new applications is to think what other barriers might be put in our way, and that's where the novelty will come around.
Thank you. Mike.
Hello, I'm Mike Ryan. I run a company called Idaho in Manchester, and my main business is actually dealing with big bits of data. So I should actually be in the other group this morning, but was asked to be in this one. But I also do a lot of consultancy on futurology, and one of the things I do for businesses and for local government is something called horizon mapping, which is looking at what's going to be happening in the next 2 to 3 years and how that's going to affect a business or a sector in a particular way. One of the things that struck me yesterday is trying to find an analogy for where we are now to see where we're going in the future. And I think one of the parallels we can draw from the situation we're in at the moment is have a look at Britain's railways and have a look at what happens there, because we have overcrowding on some trains, we have overcrowding on certain parts of the internet, we have slow trains, we have fast trains, we've yet to have a bullet train in the UK, we've yet to have a supersonic train in the UK. And I think the analogy I can make for infinite bandwidth is if you imagine being able to travel from Manchester to London in 2 seconds. That's the sort of journey time that suddenly starts to make infinite bandwidth perhaps a bit more real in people's heads. And that step change is going to be so dramatic on our lives. But I don't think the bandwidth is the only story, because you've also got to look at hardware, at the actual devices that will be using the bandwidth, and how they interact and work together. One of the things we talked about yesterday was looking at whether latency is an issue for every single internet application that's out there. And if you look at things like email, latency actually isn't too much of an issue, because none of us expect email to be instant, we expect it to be delivered. If we want something instant, we phone someone, or we send them perhaps a text, or even we use a tweet. But email is something that isn't latency dependent. Whereas if we're watching, as I was trying to do, the penultimate episode of Shameless online the other day, having been on holiday, and being completely frustrated because the whole of the world was also doing the same thing, I'd like that to be prioritised for me in some way, so that I could see that without Frank Gallagher jerking in and out even more than he does in real life. So I think maybe there's a halfway house we come to here, where we start to look at prioritising different types of traffic, and that's how we start to get to a faster world of internet access by intelligent use. And that doesn't mean to say someone who's got more money can have a faster internet connection. That's saying that certain types of data have a higher priority than others in terms of the speed in which they're delivered to you.
Thank you, Mike. Claire.
Hi, I'm Clem Herman from the Open University. My interest and most of my work that I do is related to issues about inequalities and other social kind of issues around technology, and particularly interested in things about the digital divide, which I know is a bit of an old hackneyed phrase, but I think that was one of the points that we raised in our group yesterday, was to look at what do we mean when we're talking about infinite bandwidth? Who is that for? Who has access to it? And can we, in some way, assume that, or can we work towards a situation where that infinite bandwidth is shared more equally amongst not only within this country and the kind of issues that you're talking about, bandwidth, that Mike's just referred to, but also on a global scale, who has access to the technologies, and how best can we ensure that the increase in bandwidth has a wider application?
Off we go. Does someone in the audience want to make a point or raise a question? Yes, please. Could you say who you are, please?
My name is Trine. I'm an independent researcher, and one of my particular interests is cyber psychology. I don't actually know where to start because this is so completely overwhelming that I'm finding I don't even know the language to pose the question in. And so I'll start somewhere. It seems to me that the technology that we're inventing and creating far outreaches our normal capability to handle it in terms of decision making. I mean, you talked about a 5-year future. We're probably creating a technology that's going to have at least 100 years.
Off we go. Does someone in the audience want to make a point or raise a question? Yes, please. Could you say who you are, please?
My name is Trine. I'm an independent researcher, and one of my particular interests is cyber psychology. I don't actually know where to start because this is so completely overwhelming that I'm finding I don't even know the language to pose the question in. And so I'll start somewhere. It seems to me that the technology that we're inventing and creating far outreaches our normal capability to handle it in terms of decision making. I mean, you talked about a 5-year future. We're probably creating a technology that's going to have at least a 100-year future in terms of the present time. So I'm, like underwhelmed, overwhelmed, completely confused. And there's one specific point, the aspect about negativity. I have to say, it really pisses me off when I hear that used, because actually what we're dealing with when we're talking about negativity is as it is now, not necessarily problems, but opportunities that we're seeing which we feel as problems. That's all. Now, what does it mean in everyday terms? Where do I find a perceptual holodeck in everyday terms?
Right. I feel a strong urge from Brian to come in at this point. No? Yes.
Yes, I share some of your disquiet, I suppose, in the way language is being used to describe these things. And I think you make a vitally important point. The language that we're currently using to describe these things has been, I think, captured by the industry. So there's this process of language capture going on. So look at first generation broadband, which is probably the broadband you've got in your house, if you've got broadband, ADSL. It isn't broad at all, but that's what it's called. And now we've got this new thing that's coming out, super fast broadband. Okay, super fast broadband is neither super nor fast. And so what's happening, I think, is the language is being captured, and it makes it even more difficult to think it through. And how I think about it is, we know that the digital infrastructure, which is embedded increasingly in our lives, is changing very rapidly. And actually, if we get our minds around it in a positive way, and I agree with you about the negativity, then we have the capability to deliver transformational digital infrastructure. Now, what is that? It's a deep meshing of the human and technical systems that surround us. And that's why social networking is so important, because the social aspects of this are, I think, much, much bigger than the technology. And that's what we did yesterday. We forgot about the technology. And it doesn't matter that you don't understand what infinite bandwidth zero latency is. Just forget it. Because we're talking, I think, about, we're on the brink of something where, you're right, we're making decisions that will last for multiple years, not 5 years. And I think it's really important. And I think the other thing that's important, why I think it's very important that this festival has this sort of session, it needs people who say, stop talking that crap about latency and tell me what you really mean. And it needs a deep understanding of this from the artistic and cultural and creative sectors. Otherwise, the telecoms industry and the techies will just run away with it, which we don't want. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think your question and your point is so important that it needed that kind of response. And so all I would say is keep thinking the way you're thinking, because it's vital that those sorts of questions are asked. It's really, really important. And it's important to the future of our economy and to the future of our society, this stuff. And I feel, as you can tell, I feel that at a visceral level. It's that important.
Mike, futurologists, you're very much in the business of thinking up names for things that might come in the future as a kind of handle on those things. Are you guilty thereby of obscuring the debate and making it harder for people?
I have no marketing qualifications, so in that sense, I'm not going to invent words that maybe make things sound better than they are, or try and invent adverts that show monsters and film characters coming down my phone line on TV to promote my broadband service. No, I think it's keeping our feet on the ground, and I think you raise a very valid point. The problem with technology is it creeps. Although we say that things are moving quickly, in our world it's actually moving quite slowly in terms of what we're perceiving. And the creep of Facebook, in terms of being a place that now millions of people spend at least an hour a day on. The creep of the iPlayer and the way that we now start to consume content on TV that we never used to. They are all coming in, but they're coming in now in terms of days rather than in months or years. I did a presentation recently where we looked at how old bits of the internet were, and the iPlayer is only 2 years old. The App Store is just celebrated its second birthday. Yet these are now embedded in our society in a way that they're never going to be removed from, probably. So I think this is what happens, is technology creeps up behind you, and suddenly you're using it without really knowing where it's come from or what's happening. And I think as long as you embrace that, one of the problems that we've got at the moment is that the volume of data that Clem's really talked about, and the issue that we've had up till now is a lot of the information that is available out there is starting to overload us. And the quality of the way that we can interpret that information is still fairly poor. If we're looking at first-generation broadband, we're probably looking at first-generation search in the same way. And it's if we get faster connectivity and if we get more and more information, and I think the web's growing at about 11% a month at the moment, or some ridiculous figure like that. So how can we actually start to navigate that in a meaningful way? And I think through social networks, and I completely agree with Brian, if you look at the way that now peer experience and peer recommendation of people that you know, even if they're digitally online somewhere, is a far more important driver than an advertiser coming to you. We're now going to start to possibly work as social groups to make sense of the information that's out there. And I think that's a really interesting next move for society in general, is that we start to move into what I call a care economy, which is a different economy from a knowledge economy, because you don't really need to know anything anymore. All the facts are out there, you just know what to do with them. What we have to rediscover is our humanness, and it's actually putting technology in the context of that, rather than saying that technology is going to become the thing that we obey and use in a way that it controls us, rather than the other way around. I don't know if that's helpful, but...
Right, I know Trevor was waiting to come in, but was it on this point that you wanted to come in, or were you going to raise a new one?
I think it will flow.
Yeah, please, go with it.
My name is Bob Israel. I'm the Artistic Director of Contact, so welcome. Good to have you all here in the building. I'm going to make a couple of quick comments and then try to end with a question. I'm glad you mentioned marketing, because a lot of the language is about marketing and about, that sort of, pulling in people with the language. Just to try to give a few concrete examples from the cultural sector, from the arts sector. I know, for example, I'm collaborating at the moment with an organization called Culture Hub in New York, and they developed a real-time workshop process for theater between New York and the Art Institute of Seoul, because they wanted people to teach in New York. They wanted professors based in New York to teach in Seoul, but people didn't want to move. So they've created a weekly online theater class that's done for theater students, and now that's expanded to multi-location plays. So I think that's that kind of creative output. This stuff starts to translate into real creative interaction, and that's where the latency becomes a real issue. We're actually doing an event here on Saturday where we're going to work with some young hip-hop artists from Manchester and then some young hip-hop artists in New York and do a freestyle session. And latency in terms of rhythm will become a real challenge, and we're testing that tomorrow. So I think that word latency has is something that comes up in music all the time in terms of timing and rhythm, and rhythm is obviously a major part of communication and how things flow. So just to say, to try to give some tangible meaning to those words. In terms of, one other comment I would mention. I was just in Gambia, and I was working with local artists in Gambia, and it was amazing to see the lack of access to high-speed internet there and how it impacted young artists there who have such a desire to develop and connect internationally. For example, there was one, and how people would cope with it. There was one guy that I met who actually uses 2 laptops so that he can sort of load on one and work on the other and then jump back and forth because he has to wait so long. And the kind of dedication it takes, because when he wants to watch an artist to be inspired on YouTube, he has to wait an entire evening, before he can see one video. So I think it is still very significant. And at the same time, we recorded some music with those artists, came back here, and now we're using Facebook to distribute that material to create awareness of a growing artistic scene in Gambia, which isn't really known internationally. And then very quickly, there's a kind of viral buzz happening, or maybe that's a bit of a code. The music that we recorded in Gambia is now traveling around the world very quickly through the social network, and people are sharing it, and it's proliferating. So, so an area that has challenges in terms of broadband, is trying to cope with that in interesting ways, and then trying to find ways to output that content and then redistribute it in places where it's faster. So I just think, in terms of us in the arts, it really is affecting us significantly, and it really is. It is an exciting time for artistic collaboration. I'll try to wrap off with just this last thought. One thing I've noticed, it's interesting, when I have a hard time getting in touch with artists, I tend to write on their Facebook wall, because they get back to me quicker than if I send them emails. So I think there's something about, too, the modes of communication. What I'm really interested in now, I find in the background, the offices of our organization, we're actually behind the artistic side, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about real-time collaboration, because one of the things that I find we struggle with, we do so many projects, it's very difficult to document what we do. And my thinking is, if we could start to, instead of exchanging on email, if we could start to use Google Documents or other things, Google Wave perhaps, to maybe not, so that's why I want to hear from you. How can we use, what tools or what ideas can we think in terms of how we administer and manage projects so that we are actually documenting in a more robust way what we do?
Okay, right now, I know there's other people in the audience waiting to come in, but we've got plenty of time. We can explore these things.
Can I just answer the gentleman's question? Yes, it is researchable.
Well, I did actually say that I was going to rephrase the questions, so that everyone could hear, because we don't have a roving mic. And I'm not going to attempt to do that, but what I will do is I'll say that I think you identified 2 things. One is the issue of latency in terms of real-time collaboration, and the other one is the notion of universal access. I hope, Trevor, that's...
Well, I think the first question, which I think follows from it, and the replies, is that the question is it researchable? And I think the question it is. I think the normal research process is possible to identify the relevant questions. The literature in this area is vast because it's not actually in terms of the libraries or the journals and stuff, but it is important. I think one of the most interesting things that we tend to do in the area we're in is we can trying to understand the richness of case studies or action research. So to you, I think that's, but my academic hat, it is researchable. Okay.
Brian, are you waiting to come in?
I would love to come in, yeah, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well,
Directly at that point. This is a live issue for me, personally, and I think it's a big issue. We're trying to document what we're doing. For example, I wanted to put an open, shared calendar on the internet so that I could share the activity and projects happening in the space that I'm responsible for in London. I've done extensive work looking at shared calendar applications. They are all crap. I know exactly what I want. I know what it looks like. I want something that has a kind of 3D feel about it, that can act as an archive for things that happened in the past, that I can attach video, text, photographs to, without having to post to Vimeo, Flickr, Posterous. I'm using Posterous a lot, and I'm trying to document what's happening in the space that I have. And it is a big worry for me, because I'm worried, because of the speed at which things are happening, I'm worried that I won't be able to successfully document it. And I don't agree with, I'm sorry, Trevor, I don't agree with Trevor. It is researchable, but I can't find the kind of state of the art that makes me feel less anxious about it, if you see what I mean. And if it is out there, please someone point me in the right direction. What did I end up doing? I ended up using Google Calendar. I don't like Google Calendar. All I wanted was a shared calendar app that was available on any device. Mac, PC, Linux, mobile phone, anything. And I can't find one I can't find an open source one, I can't find anything. So I've ended up using Google Calendar, which, is sort of the best I can do. And I share your concern. And it's a speed thing, I think, as well. But one thing I would point out, when it comes to latency, if the financial services industry needs very low latency servers because they're doing real-time trading, then they can get it. They co-locate their servers. They're looking at microsecond timing now, not millisecond timing. But if we, in the creative and cultural sector, identify a need for zero latency or low latency, can we get it?
Yeah.
So,
Another concern.
yeah, so it just depends on your priorities. If this stuff is as important as I feel it is to the future of the way we're developing our whole cultural structure, then we need a test bed. We need a sandbox or a space we can play that we can test those things out. And I think it's great that you're having the same problem I am, because I don't feel so alone.
Reminded of the comment that I've heard made before, which is to say that an illustration of the importance of latency is that sending big hard disks through the post, the bandwidth is excellent, but the latency is rubbish. And I suppose you could say that where you don't have access, as in Gambia, that's a latency issue in a sense, because it takes you that long to get to a place where you do have access. And I know, Clem, in your group yesterday, you were looking very much at the notion of ubiquity. Do you want to come in at this point? Would you like to add anything at this point?
Technology. I suppose we were starting from the point, as I mentioned before, it links into this idea about ubiquitous access, and so it's about being able to, first of all, it's the issue about where, who has access, and that's an enormous problem, and perhaps you kind of, we have to kind of suspend our sort of disbelief on that one and just assume that that's the case. But then there's also that kind of sense of what we were talking about was the kind of cyborg life, which is not, it's not sort of becoming cyborgs in the sort of sci-fi way, but actually a way of describing how our lives have become. And this has been well written about, but just that we are so that technology is so kind of enmeshed in the way that we do things, and so unconsciously in our lives, that we are merged with our technology. And I think that's, for many people, that's already the case. And, you seamlessly use technology in every aspect of your life. But looking at how that moves forward into a situation where all devices, for example, are connected, where, again, we're not sort of switching from looking at our iPhones and then flicking TVs on, and then it sort of goes through to ideas about the smart home, so that your home knows when you're coming home and things are switched on, and your fridge reorders its whatever it needs to order from your online supplier and so on. These are ideas that have been around for a long time, but I think that we are moving towards a situation where we are sort of, as I said, seamlessly part of that kind of cyborg life. And I think the challenge, I suppose, is to ensure that we direct that and we're not kind of controlled by it, and that we have kind of agency within that, rather than being sort of the kind of nightmare scenario of being in some kind of sort of 1984 world where that technology controls us. So that was really what the kind of ideas that we were discussing, with this sort of parallel idea of being in again, this kind of digital divide notion. And I think the point that you brought up about Gambia is really important, and I think there are creative solutions, but it's not just about Gambia. You look at this city, who has access to, who even has access to the internet. We still have a minority of the population, but still a section of the population who don't feel digitally included, whether that's, very often very correlated with kind of socioeconomic status, but, there are places where people can't afford that, and access is still not universal for everyone. And there are also issues about age differences, gender differences. Delighted there are many women in the audience, but that this is obviously a generational thing. But I think there are still issues about inequalities that relate to all of those kind of aspects. And I think we have to be mindful of that if we don't want to just replicate the kind of inequalities that already exist elsewhere.
Thank you, Pam. I'm relying on you panel members to indicate to me when you want to come in. I'd quite like to go back to the audience. You've been waiting to make your point. So could you say who you are, please?
Yeah, I'm Steve Manthorpe with the Artimount group who are here today. I wanted to just to respond to the first questioner and then just have a thought. I think cultural practitioners and technologists both have a love of, and to some extent a vested interest in, lofty and exclusive jargon. And that the vilest coalition of all is a cultural practitioner who's attempting to demonstrate her or his technological credentials. And so I do think you get an awful lot of bullshitty language in sort of digital and media practice. And we ought to watch out for it, and we ought to slap ourselves on the wrist when we feel guilty. That's just response to the first question. My thought was, I was trying to think of the earliest encounter, the earliest clash or illusion between latency and cultural practice. And I think I remember Captain Beefheart telephoning in the vocal to a track in a recording studio, which interested me because it strikes me as being not wishing latency away, but actually recognising it as an issue and something that...
My name is Bob Israel. I'm the Artistic Director of Contact, so welcome. Good to have you all here in the building. I'm going to make a couple of quick comments and then try to end with a question. I'm glad you mentioned marketing, because a lot of the language is about marketing and about, that sort of, pulling in people with the language. Just to try to give a few concrete examples from the cultural sector, from the arts sector. I know, for example, I'm collaborating at the moment with an organization called Culture Hub in New York, and they developed a real-time workshop process for theater between New York and the Art Institute of Seoul, because they wanted people to teach in New York. They wanted professors based in New York to teach in Seoul, but people didn't want to move. So they've created a weekly online theater class that's done for theater students, and now that's expanded to multi-location plays. So I think that's that kind of creative output. This stuff starts to translate into real creative interaction, and that's where the latency becomes a real issue. We're actually doing an event here on Saturday where we're going to work with some young hip-hop artists from Manchester and some young hip-hop artists in New York and do a freestyle session. And latency in terms of rhythm will become a real challenge, and we're testing that tomorrow. So I think that word latency has it's something that comes up in music all the time in terms of timing and rhythm, and rhythm is obviously a major part of communication and how things flow. So just to say, to try and give some tangible meaning to those words. In terms of, one other comment I would mention. I was just in Gambia, and I was working with local artists in Gambia, and it was amazing to see the lack of access to high-speed internet there, and how it impacted young artists there who have such a desire to develop and connect internationally. For example, there was one, and how people cope with it. There was one guy that I met who actually uses 2 laptops, so that he can sort of load on one and work on the other, and then jump back and forth because he has to wait so long. And the kind of dedication it takes, because when he wants to watch an artist to be inspired on YouTube, he has to wait an entire evening, before he can see one video. So I think it is still very significant. And at the same time, we recorded some music with those artists, came back here, and now we're using Facebook to distribute that material to create awareness of a growing artistic scene in Gambia, which isn't really known internationally. And then very quickly, there's a kind of viral buzz happening, or maybe that's a bit of a code. The music that we recorded in Gambia is now traveling around the world very quickly through a social network, and people are sharing it, and it's proliferating. So, so an area that has challenges in terms of broadband, is trying to cope with that in interesting ways, and then trying to find ways to output that content and then redistribute it in places where it's faster. So I just think, in terms of us in the arts, it really is affecting us significantly, and it is an exciting time for artistic collaboration. I'll try to wrap off with just this last thought. One thing I've noticed, it's interesting, when I have a hard time getting in touch with artists, I tend to write on their Facebook wall, because they get back to me quicker than if I send them emails. So I think there's something about, too, the modes of communication. What I'm really interested in now, I find in the back rooms, the offices of our organization, we're actually behind the artistic side, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about real-time collaboration, because one of the things that I find we struggle with, we do so many projects, it's very difficult to document what we do. And my thinking is, if we could start to, instead of exchanging on email, if we could start to use Google Documents or other things, Google Wave perhaps, to maybe not, so that's why I want to hear from you. How can we use, what tools or what ideas can we think in terms of how we administer and manage projects so that we are actually documenting in a more robust way what we do?
Them into the rest of the thing that overwhelms us. I'm getting to the point of saying, I only want to do certain things with this technology. I'm not going to get involved in endless lists and all that. I shall feel overwhelmed by it. Maybe this is a sign of aging, but I think it's true of all human beings that you want to go so far. How can we help people to choose just that bit of it that really makes sense for them in a natural and instant way for them to use? I think that's one of the major challenges that we face.
In use of latency, when I first came onto the net, it was a time of internet news. So you would post news to a news group and subscribe to news groups, and the news would trickle around the world over a period of days, which means that you could have conversations that start in one time that don't reach you until some time later, and you get all sorts of cross-fertilization of conversations. So there, the latency was quite significant, and it allowed for odd conversations to start up, where someone would start to say something, you'd start to say something before you'd seen what they'd written, and the conversation would evolve in the weirdest direction sometimes. Also on the latency thing, I started to think about the time shifting. So with time shifting, if you 2 or 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, I used to record television programs and time shift them to watch them at a time of my choosing. Now I let the network do that for me, so I use iPlayer. So there's a time shift there. So I'm using technologies that allow me to play around with time. And that's a sort of a major scale. So it's 2 orders of magnitude up on the latency of networks. So there was that. Just on the topic of the other question, which was, remind me, the one before. It was, it'll come back to me. I'll try to remember out of time. Yeah.
Well, all I was just going to add very quickly was this takeover technology is nothing new. There are people in the 1910s, 1920s who refused to have a telephone. There are people who refuse to have a TV, which is another thing. And I think what we're looking at here is this similar thing that we're talking about now. And you know, there are people who will not want to be, they'll do the good life. I've thought about quitting the internet and doing that myself more than once in the last 13 years. And that's okay, because I think, you know, we are a caring, inclusive society, and if people don't want to engage in stuff like this, then they don't have to. You know, this shouldn't be stuffed into people's faces. If the BBC stopped doing linear transmissions and purely do the iPlayer, which is a possibility in the future, I think that Middle England would have an uproar, and you know, it would never be the same again. So that on one side, my own parents are in their 70s. I got them involved in being online by showing them one thing to do, and I completely agree with you, Ken. Give them something which is easy that they can understand. And in my case, it was my mum having a sister in Canada who just wanted to contact her by email because the post wasn't working properly. And things spawned from that to the point now where my mother's buying music online and even ripping videos from a torrent, I found out the other day, which I was quite shocked about, and I never showed her, but she suddenly discovered that she can get things which are ahead of the UK by getting them from America. So anyway, I will not divulge their names, but it's quite interesting how a 78-year-old can go from email in 4 years ago to probably being West Wales' most wanted now. So there we go.
Tony, oh sorry.
Just following again the question from the BBC. In some ways, you learn from something. Now, the thing I hate is filling expense forms. I mean, you know, I can never do it. But the way that actually turns to learn now is that on my iPhone, I really started initially with making photos of the receipts and sort of stuff. But I've gone through now to 5 different versions. The things that I actually try to understand or to use myself, it is in terms of use. So the question, it's so cheap through the applications. And with 59p, you know, and I think one of them was very expensive, which is £1.59, nearly killed me financially. But the question is, you know, using something like that, I now find that very useful. But unfortunately, I do not copy, I don't make a photograph of them yet on the phones. But I think it's a very, very different way of doing things. You know, the application, you learn a little bit from that, okay, and then you get more and more, I suppose, confident what you tend to do and what you need. So in the past, the background, you would say what your requirements are, because a lot of technologies become, we don't understand, we don't know what our requirements are. But if we try something like, oh yeah, expenses be okay, or this little thing, and then you go through these versions, and it makes a difference. So it actually adapts. You're adapting, your requirements, if you like, or your needs adapt, but you learn for the applications. But you've learned them from a very different learning path to do it.
Tony, did you want to come in on voluntary digital divide, as it were, before we go back to the audience? I went blank for a moment as well.
No, the comment I was going to make was about finding the very, very simple application as the way, and the email picked up on that. It's, I think we, as technology users, we do have imagination about what's possible, but for people who aren't everyday users of technology, then our imagination is just too wild. It needs very, very practical, very, very mundane things, really, being able to replicate something that you do on a daily basis.
One of the problems I have with that notion, I think, is just the idea that I've often heard in the past that the internet will become that much more accessible when people can access it through their televisions. And many attempts at doing that have not really succeeded. In other words, trying to force one technological form into another one does not necessarily work. I want to go back to the audience in a moment, but Clem, you wanted to come in first.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up that point about sort of simple applications thing, because I think one problem that I see with sort of, let's say, IT education is that a lot of the curriculum, if you look at school curriculum, it does tend to focus, and you're all probably much closer to that experience than I am, but is that, well, the focus is on doing the very simple but the very mundane, and that's actually what puts a lot of young people off IT. So you do your GCSE in IT and you learn word processing, spreadsheets, and PowerPoint. Whereas the stuff that you're doing at home, or the stuff that you want to do, is, oh no, that's far too complicated and advanced, and the teacher doesn't understand it anyway. And I think that's actually one of the problems. I mean, we see nationally the reduction in the numbers of young people going into computer science education, or going into sort of having an interest in that kind of advanced IT. And again, it's a gender thing. It's something that happens a lot. A lot of girls get put off IT through the sort of geeky culture in teenage years, etc., etc. But I think one of the big issues is around the IT education, and that it is mundane and it's not picking up on people's interests.
Right, let's go. We've got people in the audience. I've just made the point that we've heard a lot about latency, not so much about bandwidth. So, yes, your point. Yeah, just say who you are.
Yeah, my name's Chris Taggart. I'm sort of a data advocate. I do openly local. I wasn't really sure what this whole session was going to be about, but one of the things seems to be, when you're talking about infinite bandwidth, zero latency, one of the problems is that we, people, don't have infinite bandwidth and zero latency. And the funnel that we're making, as the bandwidth gets greater and the latency gets shorter, the funnel that we're doing between what's out there and what we can cope with is getting steeper. The angle's getting sharper. And it's that K-shirky thing about we haven't got an information overload, we've got filter failure, and we need to develop better filters in order to otherwise it's just not going to work. It's not going to work. And it particularly won't work for those people who are not naturally wanting to get involved in it. And I think the other thing is that there's also another issue that as we get to infinite, as we sort of approach these ever greater bandwidths and shorter latencies, there's another aspect to those filters, which is those filters allow all sorts of things to happen that couldn't happen before, and not necessarily even good things. It may be that there is no such thing as privacy, there is no such thing as private data in the future, because we're approaching so much bandwidth and such short latency and such computing power that it's going to do this. So I think a lot of the discussion underlying is about filters.
Okay, just very briefly to say, because I know a lot of people came in after I gave the introduction, the theme of infinite bandwidth, zero latency, is to take it to the extreme in order to think into the future about the kinds of applications and services that we might see. In other words, to get beyond thinking about what if we had a lot more bandwidth and start thinking, well, what if bandwidth didn't matter anymore, or what if latency didn't matter anymore. So that's one point there about the huge increase in data throughput leading to a filter crisis. Do you want to say your point as well, and then we can go back to the panel?
Yeah, thanks. My name's Matt Farrow. I work for a communications agency in London called Link Communications. And one of our sort of primary concerns at the moment is with clients' sort of environmental approach and sustainability approach. And such as the nature of our business, it's never enough for them to want to talk to people who are already interested in that space. They want more, they want to open that up to people. And really the issue we've identified that we're generally facing is the huge disconnect between cause and effect. So people's day-to-day lives, it's the age-old issue with environmentalism. There's no connection there between that and the eventual effects or the long-term effects on climate change on the planet and what have you. And the thing that's exciting for me with this is partly the ubiquitous nature and the increase in the use of wireless and also the reams of data that we can now control and use to model. So I was just wondering if it formed part of your discussion yesterday perhaps about feedback loops generally and whether there's any way to use some of this reduced latency and increased bandwidth in sort of modelling or harnessing that data that's now coming from ever-increasing sources in far-reaching destinations.
Okay, so kind of a positive and a negative there. The one is that one of the groups referred to this yesterday, where are the exponentials as a result of increased data flow, where you end up with pressure points, and then the other point about can we decrease the latency in between political action and the consequences of it, I suppose, kind of work doing that. So, who would like to pick that up from the panel? Tony, go.
Pick up one on the notion of filters, and it relates back to the IT education that as we've got networks, as we've got everything connected, there's lots of different ways of combining information together. So one of the approaches I try to take is to play with the technology and play with different applications, plug them together, play with different information flows, plug them together, and get value from them. And going back to Brian's problem earlier on of not having the ideal calendar application, I'm not sure that that's necessarily a good way of thinking, the ideal application for a task. The world I live in is one where I've got multiple places where I input data into my calendars. I do it on my laptop, on my work machine, on my phone. And the information flows. It flows around the various other applications I've got and gives me different views and different combinations over those information flows. So I've built up a whole variety of filters on various sorts of information, and I route and switch that information to places where it gets recombined in meaningful ways for me, which might not be meaningful to anyone else. Some of them are public spaces. My blog aggregates various feeds, but some of them are very, very personal for particular things that I'm working on. And the attitude I do all that with is play. I'm quite happy to say that I spend most of my time playing. I'm exploring the space. I'm exploring this combination space of different functions and applications. And so when I say, back to the earlier point of that we need to, for people who are self-excluding, show them applications that are mundane, that's mundane to me. I mean, it might be something that's exciting to them. PowerPoint and Word is mundane to everyone, I think, but it's things that become mundane to me simply because I have so completely assimilated them. It's natural for me to wire things together in odd ways. I have there's no fear. I don't think I will break the web or the internet if I do these things. So it's that opening up of attitudes that's an important part, and feeling happy to play with the technology.
Someone else want to come in? That's fine. I'll just quickly interject in terms of the point about impact on the environment. I think one of the interesting things of the impact of the first generation of broadband, which brought us something like Wikipedia, is that that's a profoundly disalienating thing. In other words, with Wikipedia, you can instantly change the world's reference work, which reduces the gap between what is published and what people say, and that reduces alienation. So does someone want to pick that up? Clem, that sounds like something you might want to go with.
Well, not on that particular point. I was just thinking about another idea that we had yesterday, which sort of relates a bit to your environmental kind of constituency, because we were looking at issues about, just how this new bandwidth could generate different ways of working. So, for example, new business models using open source methods, software, that would actually, that kind of approach has been very much on a voluntary basis and hasn't been the kind of business model that big business has used and the internet for. And how are there ways in which there are new business models that are much more cooperative in the way that they work, much more environmentally conscious, green, or whatever, however you want to describe that. But are there opportunities then within this kind of increased bandwidth for, in a way, harking back to the kind of origins of the internet, the kind of ethics of the original internet founders, which was very much around the kind of visions of a much more cooperative way of being in the world. And one of the things we looked at was about smart energy maintenance and whether there was, again, we haven't got the solutions, they were just ideas really, but about how we could look at ways of collaborating, whether it's sort of from homes or personal devices, sort of a collaborative energy management, or within a community, and using the technologies for doing that in a much more sort of seamless way than it happens at the moment. So I think there are huge potentials, I think, for taking technology into these kind of areas and to use it for the kind of ideals that a lot of people are looking at.
Brian, tell me, is there an information overload crisis? Is it just going to get worse, or does the iBeazle technology give us an opportunity to crack that?
Well, I like noise. I like noise on Twitter. I like noise on the internet. I like noise because there's a great richness and complexity in it. And I think we're making a mistake if we over-tune our filters. So, for example, my email is spam filtered at my server level, but I don't have filters on my email very much. I never delete any email, ever, because I can find stuff if I don't delete it, and the cost of storage goes to zero. So I like noise, and I think noise is helpful. I also think noise. I think it's becoming more challenging for us to be tracked. So I don't actually think, I'm not as afraid as some people are of the state tracking our every move. I mean, they can try if they want, but it's going to get more difficult for them to do things like that. And the environmental thing, I want to come back on the environmental thing. I think the idea that we can integrate some of this technology to make our cities operate in a better way for the planet, I think is very important. I mean, I've worked on schemes where you integrate a fibre optic communications network with a smart public transport infrastructure and building management, so that you don't overheat buildings, and you have a district heating scheme which tunes its output to what the people in the city are doing and what people in the buildings are doing. I think there's a richness in there and an ability to interact with our surroundings where the technology becomes ambient, but the technology is ambient, but the intention is to minimise our impact. And we know, if you look at BT's costs, for example, the UK copper network is very, very expensive to run in terms of carbon and in terms of real cost, electricity cost. A fibre optic network uses about, depending on who you believe, anywhere between sort of 15 and 25% of the energy load of a copper network. So moving to fibre is actually, providing you pick the right technology, is a greener thing to do. And I think that, as you can tell, I'm quite an optimist about this sort of stuff. But I think it has to be approached with from a human context, and build outward from the human, not a top-down approach to city management or building management. And I think there are benefits for us in that thinking. And I think the iBZL idea plays to those things. iBeazle, okay, thank you. More jargon. Do we need more jargon?
Yeah. It's all very well you say you like knowledge. You're one of the few people I know who can live blog, tweet, and listen to a debate at the same time. I mean,
Not very well, actually. I am live blogging sessions. I'm not actually doing comments with people, but I'm trying to track. So there's quite a lot of people. I don't know if people in the room tweeting or whether it's coming from outside.
And in terms of, we're very aware, and I mean, I'm sure all of us do to some extent, maintain multiple channels of communication on our on our computer systems these days. Ken, is there a shift in human psychology that's taking place that enables them to cope with that in a way that your example before of the very simple video communication with grandchildren will never catch up with? Are we changing as beings?
Well, one of the things I've always been pleased about in my career is the technology has shifted enormously in 40 years. People haven't moved an inch, as far as I can tell. And I'm very relieved about that because it makes life that little bit simpler. So I don't see a great deal changing. That there's a particular thing I think happens with some people, and I don't know how general this is, but taking up the point of feedback loops in a very specific way. Most of us, I guess, don't know how much energy we expend, how much of what our carbon footprint is, even what we spend our money on. And some of the interesting applications are where you can get that kind of information in your household or whatever. And there's quite a lot of signs that does change people's habits. It's about, if you don't know what you're doing, you don't have any way of reflecting on it and deciding what you can do. If you do get information in a simple, easy to manage way, you can then start doing things with it. So I do think some of the applications, I would almost want them at a micro kind of level to enable us to take a little bit more control of our own lives. And I think there's good signs that when there are big issues around, and we know we should be engaging in that kind of world, I don't want to know about my alcohol consumption, though. So this varies. Some things you do want to know about, and some things you don't. So I think information is useful to people, and there are signs that they will do something with it. I think there's an awful lot. One of the interesting things to me about the internet is we talk about globalization and big issues. How do we get down to what really matters for people, and what information that they can be given, they can work with, that really helps them to shape their own lives, control their own lives. I think they're the important ways of managing an awful lot of these new opportunities that we have.
Okay. Let's try and pick up another thing from the audience, and this is someone bursting to come in from the panel. Okay, someone else. Steve.
I'm Steve Walker from the OU, also. I was a graduate as well. One thing that struck me, just looking at the list of things that came up, that hadn't really occurred to me yesterday, but it doesn't just matter where we're going with this stuff. How we get there also matters in terms of where we end up as well. And I think this refers to some of the stuff that Claire was talking about as well. And in particular, I think the mapping stuff is really important because there are going to be geographies of this. So, for example, the ability to collaborate culturally that we were talking about earlier may not work between Manchester and New York because there may be too much latency, but it may work between Manchester and Leeds. And so, and all those people involved will simply be out of the loop because they won't be able to join us. And that's going to reintroduce a new sort of geography that will shape how some of these things pan out. I think it's an interesting thing also about how we get stuck in now in ways that might shape the way that this pans out, rather than just thinking just about where we're going.
Right. Mike, you haven't said anything for a while. Do you want to come in on this one?
Well, I'll rewind quickly to the actual environmental side of this. Who's the biggest culprit on the planet for carbon? It's the IT industry. Secondly, the way in which we've been talking about this, I think we're a bit of a crossroads at the moment. There's a potential for the internet to become industrialized further, or it could be completely deindustrialized. And I think this is going to be what plays out over the next 4 or 5 years. The biggest issue I've got, I think, with it staying as an industrialized world, and when I say that, I mean you've got things like Google, you've got things like Amazon as big players on there who are storing an awful lot of information about what we do with them, is when they start to possibly share their information for mutual benefit. And this is something which I've seen at MIT a little while ago. There's a big amount of research in the States at the moment on prediction engines, which is actually taking online and real world data about communities and then looking for unusual behaviour. And by looking at unusual behaviour, trying to track the terrorist of tomorrow. And that's a sort of a bit of a darker side, I suppose, to all of this, which is present. I don't think necessarily it's anything that we're going to see happen in the long term, but in the short term, I think politically, we've got a few decisions to make as a society as to how far we go. For example, in Sweden, if you're in the workplace, you're not allowed to even see someone's shared calendar within the organisation. That's an invasion of privacy. That's taking privacy to a different level to what we're used to. However, do we really want CCTV, which is probably denser in this country than anywhere else in the world, to be linked through to a data sharing partnership between a government and Google for mutually advantageous promotion and or monitoring? I don't know. I would probably say that that's something that all of us would not want. But that's the kind of decisions that possibly have taken place without our consent or knowledge over the last few years that maybe are things that have to come to the fore now to prevent them going any further. And I think that's quite an interesting debate that perhaps we perhaps shouldn't have had in this event, this particular discussion, but is one that's a thread for the future of this event generally.
So in a sense, it's a bit of that notion that we are, does the IPs or net, is that something that we are even less in control of than we are now? Which I think, coming back to Steve's point there, a point that interests me about as things become more latency critical and they depend on low latency, that forces them into a more local area, as it were, and there's a sense in which, and also with the environmental issue of where you put servers, the internet, in a sense, could end up becoming more local, which perhaps brings us back with a little bit more control over it rather than less, and also an interesting opportunity for local business there. Does anybody want to come in on any of those points from the panel? Go on.
So it's just with everything being connected. The idea, I was introduced to the idea a couple of weeks ago of applications having heartbeats. So Google Spreadsheets has a heartbeat. Google Spreadsheets can pull information in from the web and it can transmit it to the web, and it has a heartbeat of, I think, every second, and various functions are tied to it with various 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, so it does things at different timescales. So we have applications that are living, and picking up on the idea of the cities, once you get data sensor networks around the edges of your... If we have infinite bandwidth and infinite connectivity, then we can start plugging sensors in, the sensors can start communicating. Then the network will take on its own life. It already does. There are already systems that are automated sensor networks driving effector networks. But more and more so that will happen. As I was walking up today, on the back of one of the road signs, or 3 road signs next to each other, was the word RSS written. So RSS is a syndication technology. You use it for syndicating blog and news content around the web, and there was just this word. It's presumably the name of the contractor, but it just got me thinking, right, yes, so every sign connected. What does that mean then? You use that to then start controlling the traffic flows, or sensing the traffic flows and controlling the traffic flows, and allowing the system to respond to the behaviour that's local to it.
But you don't buy my notion, Steve's notion, that the network could become more local, and that means that we can have a stronger sense of human control over it?
I'm not... If the system's responding to you, I'm not. Do you feel you have more control or less control? This is a... Yeah, if I get better recommendations from Amazon, then I'm more in control of it or less in control of it. I know I'm less in control, but I feel better served and more in control of my experience. That's an odd one. I don't know.
Okay, anyone else want to come in on that? Time for one last point from the audience.
Yeah, on the subject of control, it seems to me that now what we have is actually fluid systems that yes, they have a certain amount of hardware to them, you know, floors, laptops, iPods, and all the rest of it, but actually that we have a fluid system in terms of information flow. And one specific thing about those people who choose to be excluded, it's taken me about 2.5 years to become comfortable with just using the internet, which is a learning curve. And this gentleman here saying about simplicity, I think that's immensely important. That's the standard place in learning anything. And as you said, this isn't new. We've been faced with technology from the Stone Age, the first time somebody took an axe. So it's not new, but maybe there's something about us being more overwhelmed by the change. That's the fact. That's why I'm interested in the psychology of it.
So what if they were thinking, you know, what if I had an infinite number of axes that were infinitely sharp? Something like that. The last comments from the panel, and then we'll close up. Go on, Brian.
Last comment. I think the points and discussion from participants in the room has been, I found it really, really interesting, and the level of engagement has been very high. I think some of the issues and questions that we've had are really on the point, particularly the point about simplicity and the need to be aware of the impact on the environment that we're having of doing this sort of stuff. And that's the thing I'm going to take away from this. I've enjoyed it very much. I've liked it as well, and I'll post the link on Twitter.
Okay. Everybody going to have a quick one word? Go for it, sir.
I think it's just an interesting discussion, but for me, I just think that my background, we really have to look at what the impact on education and education in terms of what tends to happen. And I think it's going to be a rapid change. I think if we ignore this, we're going to have major, major issues in the next few years.
For me, I'm going to take away a simplicity thing. I've got here that a lot of the technologies I play with require multiple steps, and I just jotted down that 2 steps is 1 step too hard, which is an education issue. But
I think it's been an intelligent debate, and it's centred on people rather than the technology, and that's really where it should be. And also, this change is going to happen. It's going to get faster. I don't necessarily think that's something we all should fear. It's something we should embrace, but also it's something that we should choose to opt into when we think it's something we can cope with. And don't believe the hype of the next generation of mobile phones that comes out, because those are going to start coming out weekly rather than every 6 months. So just take time and don't just get the next shiny gadget that's in the shop because someone tells you it's easy to use, because it won't necessarily be that way.
I was just pondering, what if we had been a virtual holodeck of speakers and how that would have felt as an audience. And my feeling is I'm very glad I'm here in person. I'm very much in favour of good, effective sort of virtual communication. But I think being together in a space like this has been really, really valuable. So thanks for your input as well.
I reckon there's still a future for personal communications in a face-to-face kind of way as well. I'm reflecting on what I expected this discussion to be about. I think I expected it to be much more, gee whiz, isn't all that going to be wonderful? And what's coming over quite clearly is a sense of, yeah, there's a lot that could be going on here, but how are we going to keep it on a human scale? And I think that's a terrific challenge for us. I start and have always been concerned about how human beings get benefit from this, are empowered by it, and can cope with it. And I think what you've done is to reinforce that for me. That, I think, becomes an even more significant issue as we can do even more stupendous things with this. Are we going to mention the next thing? You're going to do that?
First of all, I'd like to say Brian Common, Trevor Wood, Harper, Tony Hurst, Mike Ryan, and Ken Nixon, thank you very much.